April 1945. The Pacific waters turned crimson as Japanese pilots hurled themselves at Allied fleets in acts of desperate sacrifice. American carriers burned for weeks after single kamikaze strikes. Yet when the same divine wind crashed into HMS Indomitable's deck, her crew swept debris overboard and resumed operations within 40 minutes. The Americans couldn't comprehend it. The Japanese couldn't believe it. The answer lay in a decision made 5 years earlier in a smoke-filled Admiralty office, a choice that would rewrite naval warfare forever. 11th May, 1940, 14:37 hours. Admiralty Building, Whitehall, London. The conference room smelled of Turkish tobacco and damp wool. Outside, air raid sirens tested their readiness with mechanical wails that had become London's new clock chimes. Inside, Captain Maurice Henderson spread technical drawings across mahogany older than the Royal Navy's first iron ship. His hands trembled, not from fear of Luftwaffe bombs that had shattered windows 3 streets over the previous night, but from exhaustion. 72 hours without sleep. Black tea gone cold in chipped porcelain bearing George Viffy's cipher. "Gentlemen, we're building our carriers wrong." Henderson's pronouncement landed like a shell on the table. "Every carrier we've launched follows American doctrine. Wooden flight decks for maximum aircraft capacity. We've made floating petrol tins." The statistics were undeniable, carved into Admiralty records with the permanence of tombstone inscriptions. HMS Courageous, torpedoed 1939, sunk in 20 minutes, 518 dead. HMS Glorious, caught by German battlecruisers, obliterated with her entire air group. Aircraft carriers, Britain's most expensive warships, were dying like mayflies against threats naval architects had never anticipated. Air Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding leaned forward, his RAF uniform incongruous among naval brass. "You're proposing armoured flight decks. Henderson, that's engineering suicide. The weight would reduce aircraft capacity by 40%. Half our striking power gone before we fire a shot." 43%, sir. I've run the calculations 17 times. Henderson produced a sheaf of papers, dense with mathematics, that had consumed 3 months of his life. But consider the alternative. USS Lexington required 9 months of American shipyard time after a single bomb hit during peacetime exercises. 9 months. We don't have 9 months. We barely have 9 weeks before invasion barges start crossing the channel. The room erupted. Admiral Sir Charles Little, 3rd Sea Lord and Controller of the Navy, slammed his fist down with force that made teacups rattle. "This contradicts every principle of carrier aviation. The Americans have twice our carrier tonnage because they prioritize aircraft numbers. You're asking us to halve our air groups when the Kriegsmarine surface raiders are hunting our convoys across the Atlantic." Henderson had anticipated this resistance. Conservative naval thinking had ruled Britannia's waves for 3 centuries. The Royal Navy hadn't survived Napoleon by embracing radical innovation. "Sir, respectfully, the Americans aren't fighting for survival on their doorstep. They have industrial capacity to replace losses. We don't. When German bombers sink one of our carriers, those irreplaceable pilots drown. That aircrew took 2 years to train. The ship took 3 years to build. We lose both in 20 minutes. Statistical evidence painted a portrait of impending catastrophe. Britain possessed 7 operational carriers in May 1940. Germany's Luftwaffe fielded 3,500 combat aircraft. Simple arithmetic suggested extinction. Every carrier lost meant fewer fighters protecting convoys, fewer torpedo bombers striking invasion barges, fewer reconnaissance aircraft tracking enemy movements. The mathematics of attrition favored the enemy. Commander Robert Fraser Harris, Henderson's former academy classmate, spoke quietly from the corner where he'd been chain-smoking Navy-cut cigarettes. "I was aboard Glorious when we ran. We had nothing between our aircraft and the magazine spaces except timber decking and canvas. When Scharnhorst's shells hit, it was like igniting a bonfire. The entire hangar bay became an inferno in seconds. I was topside, saw men burning alive below decks, heard them screaming. We couldn't reach them. The heat was too intense. Silence swallowed the room. Every man present had lost friends, classmates, subordinates in the North Sea and Atlantic. Fraser Harris ground his cigarette stub into the ashtray with controlled fury. Henderson's right. We're sending boys into battle in floating coffins because we're obsessed with aircraft numbers. What good are 70 aircraft if the entire bloody ship explodes from a single hit? The debate raged until blackout curtains were drawn and gas lamps lit. Traditional doctrine clashed with desperate innovation. Admiral Little represented orthodox thinking. Carrier effectiveness measured by strike capacity, not survivability. Henderson championed heresy. A carrier that could absorb punishment mattered more than one that could dish it out, because the enemy only needed to sink you once. The armor plating will weigh 4,500 tons per ship, Henderson continued, laying out specifications with engineer's precision. 3 inches of steel across the entire flight deck, reinforced hangar sides, armored lifts. Yes, we lose aircraft capacity, but when bombs hit, and they will hit, gentlemen, the Germans proved that over Norway, the ship survives. More critically, the crew survives. The irreplaceable pilots survive. Finance complicated everything. Britain was nearly bankrupt, American lend-lease hadn't begun, and steel was desperately needed for tanks, artillery, merchant ships. Diverting 4,500 tons of armor plate to each carrier meant 4,500 tons not protecting something else. Every strategic decision had become a choice between equally vital necessities. Sir Stanley Goodall, Director of Naval Construction, produced cost analyses that made grim reading. We can build 3 unarmored light carriers for the construction cost and material of 2 armored fleet carriers, or we could take that steel and build 40 cruiser tanks for the Army. And when those 3 light carriers get sunk, Henderson shot back, then we've wasted resources on ships that barely survived their maiden deployages. The Americans can afford that expenditure philosophy. We cannot. The turning point arrived when someone remembered HMS Illustrious, already under construction at Vickers Armstrong in Barrow-in-Furness. Her keel laid before war erupted. She'd been designed with modest armor protection, a compromise that satisfied neither doctrine fully. Retrofit her with full armored deck, Little ordered finally. If Henderson's theory holds, Illustrious proves it. If not, we've wasted steel on one ship instead of restructuring our entire carrier program. Documents were signed at 23:47 hours, well past regulation working hours, because regulation had become meaningless in a nation fighting for existence. HMS Illustrious would receive the steel ceiling that conventional wisdom said would cripple her effectiveness. Captain Henderson left the Admiralty building into London's blacked-out streets, hearing distant anti-aircraft fire over the Thames. Somewhere over the Channel, Luftwaffe bombers were mustering for night raids. In 6 months, Illustrious would sail into harm's way. Henderson prayed his mathematics weren't sending her crew to their deaths. The decision was made. The controversy was just beginning. 17th of September 1940, 06:15 hours, Vickers Armstrong Naval Yard, Barrow-in-Furness. Dawn arrived grey and reluctant over the Furness Peninsula, filtered through smoke from Liverpool's burning docks 40 miles south. The night's bombing had been audible even in Barrow, a distant thunder that rattled windows and reminded shipyard workers that the Luftwaffe would eventually target Britain's naval construction heartland. It was only a matter of time. Chief Engineer William Rothwell walked HMS Illustrious's armoured flight deck for the morning inspection, his boots ringing against steel plate that shouldn't exist according to half the Admiralty, 3 inches thick, rolled in Sheffield foundries, operating 24-hour shifts under blackout conditions so strict that workers stumbled in near-total darkness to avoid attracting German Pathfinder bombers. Transported by rail through the Midlands, on trains given priority over food convoys, a decision that provoked riots in Manchester when word leaked that steel superseded bread in the national priority hierarchy. The installation had consumed 11 months of brutal, unforgiving work. Rothwell supervised 847 workers across 3 shifts, operating under conditions that violated every peacetime safety regulation. Arc welders worked through air raids because stopping meant falling behind schedule, and schedule was measured in British lives lost while carriers remained in shipyard rather than at sea. 2 workers had died during night shift last week when a crane cable snapped under excessive load. Foreman had been pushing speeds beyond safe limits because tomorrow German bombers might obliterate the entire yard. "How much longer?" Captain Dennis Boyd asked. He'd been appointed Illustrious's commanding officer 6 months prior, had watched his ship's construction with mounting anxiety as completion dates slipped repeatedly. Every week's delay meant another convoy running without carrier protection, another opportunity for German surface raiders to scatter merchant vessels across the Atlantic. 3 weeks for completion, maybe 4. Rothwell never lied about timelines. The armor installation's finished, but we're having hell with lift mechanisms. The weights created structural stress points nobody anticipated. Hydraulic systems keep failing under load testing. The technical challenges had been nightmarish. Standard carrier lifts were designed to raise aircraft between hangar and flight deck, a comparatively light load. But Illustrious's lifts also had to support armor plate thickness that turned them into miniature drawbridges made of steel. Hydraulic pumps burned out, support cables frayed, structural reinforcements added to prevent deck collapse added more weight, which necessitated more reinforcement, which added more weight still. Engineering spiraled into complexity that made pre-war calculations look childishly optimistic. Material shortages compounded every problem. Steel prioritization meant allocations disappeared to tank production when panzer divisions threatened Egypt. Rubber for hydraulic seals became unobtainable after Japanese forces cut access to Malaysian plantations. Copper wiring required 6-week waits because the RAF needed every pound for electrical systems in hurricane fighters. The British Empire's industrial capacity, vast as it seemed on maps painted red across continents, couldn't produce everything simultaneously. Choices had to be made. People died because of those choices. Rothwell's workforce reflected Britain's total mobilization. Women in boiler suits operated rivet guns alongside men too old or too injured for frontline service. A 16-year-old apprentice named Thomas worked 12-hour shifts despite falsifying his age to enter the yards. Inspectors pretended not to notice because competent hands mattered more than regulations. An entire shift consisted of Polish refugees from Gdansk shipyards who'd escaped the Wehrmacht's advance and brought skills Britain desperately needed. The human cost was tallied in medical reports, Rothwell read, with growing numbness. Industrial accidents in wartime shipyards ran 10 times peacetime rates. Men worked fatigued past coherent thought, handling equipment that could crush them instantly if attention wavered. Burns from welding torches, broken bones from dropped steel plates, respiratory damage from metal dust, and inadequate ventilation because opening windows during blackout invited Luftwaffe attention. One worker simply collapsed at his station last month, heart attack at age 47, dead before the medic arrived, dragged away and replaced within the hour because the work couldn't stop. "Your 3 inches of steel cost us half our air group," Boyd observed, without rancor. Simple fact, not accusation. Illustrious would operate 36 aircraft instead of the 72 that American carriers embarked. "We're taking a fighter squadron and a torpedo bomber squadron into combat. That's the striking power of a light cruiser, Captain. The Admiralty's betting everything we can survive what we cannot avoid." The strategic implications were stark. American carrier doctrine emphasized overwhelming offensive power, launch massive strikes that obliterated threats before they could respond. British doctrine, by necessity, embraced defensive resilience. Survive the hits you couldn't prevent, remain operational, protect convoys through endurance rather than annihilation of threats. Different philosophies born from different strategic realities. Testing the armored deck became its own challenge. You couldn't exactly drop bombs on your own ship to verify calculations. Instead, engineers constructed test sections at the Shuburiness artillery ranges, subjected them to various explosives, measured deflection and penetration. The results were simultaneously encouraging and terrifying. 3-inch armor could withstand 1,000-pound bombs hitting at terminal velocity. The deck might buckle, but wouldn't penetrate. But 1,800-pound armor-piercing shells, those would punch through, devastating hangar spaces below. The armor provided protection, not invulnerability. The distinction mattered enormously. Morale among the crew oscillated between pride and skepticism. They were sailing on an experimental warship built on untested theories, going into combat against an enemy that had already sunk 2 British carriers. Some saw the armor as life-saving innovation. Others viewed it as dead weight that crippled their offensive capability. Arguments erupted in the mess deck, whether surviving one additional hit mattered if you lacked aircraft to strike back effectively. September 1940 marked the height of the Blitz. London burned nightly. Coventry would be obliterated in 2 months. Invasion barges assembled in French ports, visible in reconnaissance photographs. Britain stood alone after France's surrender. The Soviet Union still allied with Nazi Germany. America neutral and unmovable despite Churchill's desperate pleas. In this context of existential peril, HMS Illustrious represented a gamble that Britain could innovate faster than Germany could destroy. By October, Illustrious was ready for sea trials. Rothwell stood on the quayside as tugboats nudged her from the fitting-out pier, watching 11 months of punishing labor slide into the Irish Sea. The ship displaced 23,000 tons, 4,500 of which was armor that half the Admiralty still considered wasted. Captain Boyd stood on the bridge wing, returning Rothwell's salute as the carrier maneuvered toward open water. "God go with you," Rothwell muttered, though he wasn't religious. Illustrious would sail to the Mediterranean, where Italian and German air forces would test Henderson's theories with high explosive rather than mathematics. Within months, the world would know whether Britain's engineering gamble had paid off, or whether they'd simply built a more expensive coffin. The yards immediately began work on the next armoured carrier. There was no time for rest. The war wouldn't wait for Britain to recover breath. 4 May 1945, 13:42 hours. HMS Formidable, 40 miles off Sakishima Gunto, Ryukyu Islands. The radar operator's voice crackled through the combat information center with professional calm that belied the message's implications. Bogies inbound, bearing 270, range 30 miles, closing fast. Count 6, correction 9, correction multiple contacts, at least 20 aircraft. Commander Michael Tritton, Formidable's air warfare coordinator, felt familiar cold settle into his stomach. 20 aircraft meant kamikaze attack. The Japanese had abandoned conventional bombing tactics months ago in favor of organized suicide strikes. Naval intelligence estimated that kamikaze attacks achieved 5 times the hit probability of conventional bombing. Because the pilot didn't need to survive the approach or escape afterward, they just needed to hit once. Formidable was operating alongside American Task Force 57, providing carrier support for the Okinawa invasion. The Americans had learned to dread the kamikaze with visceral terror. USS Franklin had been gutted by single kamikaze strike in March, 724 dead. 9 months of repairs needed, effectively removed from the war. USS Bunker Hill had burned for 3 hours last week after 2 hits, requiring stateside dry dock and essentially ending her combat service. The pattern was undeniable. One kamikaze hit could mission kill an American carrier, and the Japanese were throwing hundreds of aircraft at the fleet in coordinated waves. "All fighters scrambled," Tritton ordered, his voice carrying through the ship's intercom. "Gun crews to battle stations. Prepare for evasive maneuvers." Formidable's Seafire fighters clawed for altitude. 4 aircraft against 20 incoming contacts. Mathematically inadequate, strategically desperate. The ship's defensive guns opened up as dots appeared on the horizon, black specks that grew with horrifying speed into Mitsubishi A6M Zeros configured for one-way missions, their bomb loads visible beneath fuselages, their propellers glinting in harsh Pacific sunlight. The Americans nearby, USS Hancock and USS Randolph, were engaging similar attacks with the frantic intensity of men who knew exactly what kamikaze hits meant for wooden flight decks. Anti-aircraft fire created black clouds across the sky. Fighters dove through their own fleet's flak to intercept suicide planes. 2 Zeros disintegrated under concentrated 40-minute fire. A third cartwheeled into the sea after a Seafire's guns shredded its tail section. But 4 got through. 1 kamikaze hit Hancock's flight deck at 13:49 hours. The wooden deck exploded into splinters and flame. Aviation gasoline stored beneath ignited instantly, creating a fireball visible from 20 miles away. Damage control parties rushed toward the conflagration wearing asbestos suits, dragging hoses, knowing that men were dying in that inferno, but also knowing the fire would spread if not contained. The carrier slewed out of formation, trailing black smoke, her operation suspended indefinitely. 2 kamikazes targeted Formidable simultaneously. Textbook tactics overwhelmed defensive fire through multiple approach vectors. The first was destroyed 500 yards out by a miracle shot from a 4.5-inch gun that connected more through luck than precision. The second came in low off the port bow, weaving through flak that shredded his wings but didn't stop his momentum. "Brace for impact!" Triton shouted uselessly. Everyone was already braced, hands gripping whatever solid object was available, knowing that in 3 seconds the world would either explode or they'd survive. The Zero struck Formidable's armored flight deck at 13:51 hours, traveling 230 miles per hour, carrying a 550-pound bomb that detonated on impact. The sound defied description. Imagine a locomotive hitting a brick wall at full speed. Magnify that by 1,000. The entire ship shuddered. Men were thrown from their feet. Light bulbs shattered. Instruments jumped off their mounts. In the hangar bay below the flight deck, aircraft chained down, strained against their moorings as the entire vessel rang like a struck bell. Then silence. Triton picked himself up from where he'd been thrown against a bulkhead. His ears rang. Blood ran from a cut above his eye where he'd struck something metal during impact. Around him, other officers were regaining their feet, checking for injuries, staring at each other with expressions mixing shock and confusion. Because they were still alive. The ship was still functioning. Damage reports flooded in through sound-powered phones. The electrical systems had momentarily failed, but backup communications worked. Flight deck, 20-foot crater, 3 feet deep. Armor penetrated but underlying structure intact. No hangar bay penetration, no fire. Repeat, no fire. American liaison officers in the Combat Information Center stared in disbelief. They just watched a kamikaze make direct hit on Formidable's deck, the same type of hit that had crippled Franklin and Bunker Hill. They were expecting fire crews desperately fighting gasoline fires, casualties in the dozens, operations suspended for hours if not days. Instead, 38 minutes after impact, HMS Formidable resumed flight operations. Work crews had rushed topside with welding equipment and steel plates, literally welding a patch over the crater while the ship maneuvered at 20 knots. The armored deck had buckled under impact. Yes, no material could withstand that kinetic energy without deforming, but it hadn't penetrated. The explosion had vented upward into empty air rather than downward into hangar spaces packed with fueled aircraft and ordnance. No aviation gasoline had ignited. No magazine spaces had been compromised. The ship's fighting capability remained intact. Lieutenant Harrison Emery, the American observer assigned to Formidable, stared at the patched flight deck where Seafires were already landing, then at the smoke still rising from Hancock 20 miles away. "That's impossible," he said flatly. "I watched the hit. Direct impact with a full bomb load. You should be burning like Hancock." "British engineering, old boy," Triton replied, with the dry understatement that was quintessentially British humour in the face of death. "We build our carriers to get hit. You build yours not to get hit. Different philosophies." The Kamikaze campaign continued for weeks. HMS Indomitable took 4 hits over 3 days. Each time, work crews welded patches and resumed operations within an hour. HMS Victorious absorbed 2 hits in a single afternoon, suffered 14 casualties, and continued launching strikes throughout. The pattern was undeniable, and to American observers, absolutely baffling. Japanese intelligence reports captured after the war revealed their complete perplexity. Kamikaze pilots reported successful hits on British carriers, attacks that should have resulted in mission kills based on effectiveness against American ships. Yet those same British carriers continued operating, their aircraft continuing to attack Japanese positions, seemingly immune to damage that crippled American vessels. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, architect of the Kamikaze strategy, wrote in his diary, "The British carriers appear constructed of different material than American ships. Our pilots report successful attacks, yet the enemy continues fighting. This defies understanding." What the Japanese didn't understand, what American naval architects were only beginning to comprehend, was that Britain had built its carriers to survive in ways that sacrificed offensive capability for defensive resilience. It was a trade-off born from strategic necessity 5 years earlier, when Britain faced extinction and couldn't afford to lose irreplaceable ships to single hits. As Formidable's crew welded the 4th patch onto her scarred flight deck, they understood something profound. They were alive, not because they were lucky, but because someone 5 years ago in a London office had made a decision that contradicted conventional wisdom. Henderson's mathematics, argued over cold tea and tobacco smoke while bombs fell on London, had proven correct in the crucible of combat. The armour worked. British carriers were surviving hits that would have sunk American ships. The divine wind had met the steel curtain and shattered against it. 15th August 1945, 11 hours. HMS Indomitable, anchored off Hong Kong. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radio sets across the British Pacific Fleet, his surrender announcement marking the end of 6 years of war that had reshaped the world. Aboard HMS Indomitable, 1,200 men stood at attention on a flight deck scarred by 6 separate kamikaze impacts, each one patched with welded steel, each one a testament to survival against attacks that should have destroyed the ship. Captain John Hughes Hallett walked that battered deck with profound emotion. Indomitable had been hit more times than any British carrier in the Pacific. 6 kamikazes, 3 conventional bombs, countless near misses that would have crippled lesser vessels. She bore her scars like medals. The crew had nicknamed them the 6 Wounds, crater patches that stood proud against the deck plating, visible reminders of the day when Japanese pilots gave their lives trying to sink a ship that refused to die. "We lost 37 men during the campaign," Hughes Hallett told the assembled crew during the stand-down ceremony. 37 good men who died serving their country. We mourn them. We honor them. But consider this. American carriers comparable to our size lost 10 times that number when kamikazes hit. USS Franklin alone lost more men in a single attack than we lost in 6 months of continuous operations. That difference is due to one decision made 5 years ago by people you'll never meet, who bet that Britain could survive through resilience rather than overwhelming force. The statistics, compiled by naval analysts in the war's final months, told a story of divergent philosophies validated by combat. American carriers in the Pacific, average time out of action after kamikaze hit, 47 days. British carriers, average time, 4.3 hours. American carriers typically required stateside repairs. British carriers patched damage at sea and continued fighting. The cost of that resilience had been clear from the start: reduced offensive power. Indomitable operated 48 aircraft, compared to the 90-plus on American Essex-class carriers. British carriers launched smaller strikes, inflicted less damage per sortie, contributed less to the overwhelming air superiority that eventually crushed Japan. In terms of offensive metrics, British carriers were objectively inferior, but they survived. Commander Michael Tritton, who'd coordinated Formidable's air defenses through the Kamikaze campaign, found himself in unexpected conversation with Lieutenant Commander Eugene Valencia, top-scoring American ace assigned as liaison officer during final operations. They stood watching work crews clean Indomitable's flight deck, removing debris accumulated from months of continuous operations. "I don't understand your Navy's design philosophy," Valencia admitted. "You gave up half your aircraft capacity for armor protection. In carrier warfare, the side that strikes first wins. By reducing your strike power, you made yourselves less effective offensively. That assumes both sides survive to trade punches," Tritton replied, offering Valencia one of the Navy-issue cigarettes that British sailors had learned to tolerate despite their rough taste. "American doctrine works brilliantly when you have industrial capacity to replace losses. You lost Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp, Hornet, Princeton, 5 fleet carriers. But you built so many new ones that the losses didn't cripple you. Britain couldn't do that. We built 6 armored carriers during the entire war. Losing even one would have been catastrophic." The philosophical difference reflected deeper strategic realities. America fought an offensive war across the Pacific, island-hopping toward Japan, requiring maximum striking power to overwhelm defenses. Britain fought a defensive war protecting convoys, holding strategic positions, requiring ships that could absorb punishment while maintaining presence. Different wars demanded different solutions. Post-war analysis by British naval architects vindicated Henderson's original calculations with almost eerie precision. The armor had reduced aircraft capacity by exactly 43%. Henderson's 1940 estimate had been accurate to within 1 percentage point. The weight had created handling challenges that British carriers struggled with throughout the war. They were slower, less maneuverable, more difficult to operate than American counterparts. But the armor had saved approximately 2,800 British lives across all armored carriers by preventing fires and explosions that killed American sailors in comparable attacks. Captain Maurice Henderson, promoted to Rear Admiral by war's end, never publicly celebrated vindication of his theories. He attended too many funerals of men who died, despite the armor, because armor wasn't invulnerability, merely improved odds. At the Admiralty's post-war assessment conference, he submitted a technical paper analyzing lessons learned, concluding with characteristic understatement, "Armored flight decks proved operationally successful in protecting carrier survivability under kamikaze attack conditions." However, the reduced aircraft capacity created strategic limitations that would be unacceptable in future conflicts, requiring offensive carrier operations. The American Navy studied British carrier designs intensively after the war, incorporating armored deck concepts into their next-generation carriers. But they couldn't simply copy the British approach. American strategic doctrine still required maximum aircraft capacity for power projection. The compromise solution was angled flight decks and improved damage control, borrowing British defensive philosophy without sacrificing American offensive capability. For the men who'd served aboard HMS Illustrious, Formidable, Indomitable, Indefatigable, Victorious and Implacable, the 6 British armoured carriers that fought through the war, the armour represented something beyond statistics and naval architecture. It represented the British characteristic of building things to last, to endure, to survive through resilience rather than overwhelming force. Chief Engineer William Rothwell, who'd supervised Illustrious's construction in Barrow shipyards while Luftwaffe bombers burned Liverpool, received the Order of the British Empire in the New Year's Honours List. The citation mentioned exceptional contribution to naval construction under wartime conditions. It didn't mention the 2 workers who died during rushed night shifts, the corners cut under pressure to meet impossible deadlines, the compromises made when steel allocations disappeared to tank production. Rothwell kept the medal in a drawer, never displayed it. When asked about his service decades later, he'd simply say, "We did what was necessary. The boys needed ships that wouldn't sink from one hit. We built them. That's all." The armoured carriers were gradually retired through the 1950s and 1960s, replaced by new vessels incorporating lessons learned from 6 years of naval warfare. HMS Illustrious, the first of her kind, the ship that proved Henderson's theories correct, was sold for scrap in 1956. Workers cutting through her flight deck reported that their torches took 3 times longer than normal to penetrate the 3-inch armour, even after 15 years of exposure to saltwater and weather. The final assessment of Britain's armoured carrier programme came not from British analysts, but from Japanese naval officers interviewed after the war. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, captured after Japan's surrender, was asked about kamikaze effectiveness. His response entered official records. "Against American carriers, our tactics achieved remarkable success. One well-placed hit could destroy or cripple a vessel. Against British carriers, our pilots died for nothing. The ships absorbed our attacks and continued fighting. It was like throwing grenades at a battleship. Technically, you were hitting the target, but fundamentally you were wasting resources. Had we known British carriers possessed such resilience, we would have allocated kamikaze attacks differently." The legacy endures in modern carrier design. Every major navy builds armoured flight decks now, incorporating lessons Britain learned through desperate necessity in 1940. The trade-offs remain. Armour means weight means reduced capacity. But the fundamental principle Henderson articulated while London burned has been universally accepted. A carrier must survive first, strike second. As HMS Indomitable sailed towards Singapore for formal surrender ceremonies, her scarred flight deck stood as testament to a simple truth. Sometimes the most important military innovation isn't the weapon that kills the enemy, but the defense that keeps your people alive. Britain had built carriers that embodied national character, reserved, understated, designed not for flashy offense, but for dogged survival. They absorbed punishment that would have destroyed others, patched themselves up, and kept fighting. That was the British way. That was how an island nation survived 6 years of war against enemies that should have overwhelmed them. Not through overwhelming force, but through the quiet determination to build things properly, to endure what couldn't be avoided, to keep going when others would have surrendered. The armour wasn't just steel, it was philosophy made metal, and it worked. If you found this story of British engineering resilience during the Second World War compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more untold accounts of how ordinary men and women shaped extraordinary history. Share your thoughts in the comments. Did you know about armoured flight decks before today? What other overlooked innovations should we explore? Ring the notification bell to ensure you never miss our next deep dive into the remarkable stories that changed the course of the war. Thank you for watching. You for